Hi guys, it's Joe from Finding Faith, and I am back with part 3 of my series responding to evilbible.com's attacks on the gospel. I'll put links in the description below for parts 1 and 2, but basically I'm just responding to 50 points that evilbible.com has made claiming that the Bible is false based on certain things that are in the gospel. Now when I'm referring to the gospel in this case, I'm referring to the specific gospels written within the Bible, the accounts of Jesus' life and deeds written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as I've said before, it's very easy to, read what's in the Bible and it doesn't necessarily make sense the first time, or, you haven't read the Bible in a little while, or you're not thinking of it in the entire picture. Because the Bible is a complicated book, it's very easy to see something that doesn't make sense and be dismissive of it. I can be guilty of that sometimes. But with that said, with just a little bit of Google, critical thinking, spending time in God's Word, we can come to have a much healthier understanding of what's actually being said. And I think that really helps to enhance our understanding and our faith potentially. Alright, so I'm going to start with the 11th point that evilbible.com brought up. So what they say is, Paul says Christianity lives or dies on the resurrection. 1 Corinthians, they're missing an S, 15 verses 14 to 17. Yet Jesus said in Matthew 12:40 that he would be buried 3 days and 3 nights, as Jonah was in the whale 3 days and 3 nights. Friday afternoon to early Sunday morning is only 1.5 days, so he could not have been the Messiah by his own and Paul's admission. This is a very common argument, actually, and it's an interesting one because on the surface it makes a whole lot of sense. But then you have to remember that Jewish culture back in those times had a very different perception of time than we do. So back in those days, the Jewish people saw 3 days and 3 nights as any part of 1 day to any part of 2 days after that. So any part of Friday, any part Saturday, any part Sunday, 3 days and 3 nights, 3 days. Even though Sunday night wasn't counted, they still include that as a day and a night because that's just how they viewed time back then. And I'm going to put a link in the description so you guys can do some further reading at this at the website that really helped me be able to really articulate this. And there's actually reference to Esther in the Old Testament to help you guys see how this actually is used in other places in the Bible to refer to time. Alright, moving on. Jesus' prophecy in John 13:38, "The cock shall not crow till thou, Peter, hast denied me 3 times," is, according to them, false. Mark 14:66-68 shows the cock crowed after the first denial, not the third. This is a very interesting one because this is one of those areas within all 4 Gospels that is talked about, and Mark's is talked about in somewhat of a distinct way from the others. Now keep in mind that there's not a legitimate contradiction here. This is not Mark saying the cock will not crow. This is Mark simply saying that the cock will crow in a slightly different way than the other Gospel writers are saying the cock would crow. What Mark's Gospel is basically doing here is it's basically saying that the cock crows a second time after Peter's third denial. The first time it crows is after the second denial, which is a Gospel, and this particular detail is left out of the other 3 Gospels. The reason why this detail is probably unique to Mark's account is because Mark was basically Peter's spiritual son, so he had a special relationship with Peter, and Peter probably told him this more personally than, John, Luke, and Matthew may have known about. And if you want further proof, basically think of it this way. The other 3 Gospels are not saying that the third denial was the only time the cock crowed. We're basically just getting supplemental details with that. For people who have a hard time with the supplemental details, think of it this way. If I told you that there was this one story and you didn't believe me, and someone told you the exact same story word for word, and then someone else told you that exact same story again word for word, you wouldn't believe any of us because you think that there would be some sort of collusion going on. So it only makes sense that the Gospels would have some slightly different details because that's the only way that it's going to really be verified, is by multiple witness accounts that have to have some differing details here and there. As long as the details all make sense and don't blatantly contradict each other, the wording can be a little bit off, there can be a detail that's left out of one or added in another one, but the message is still the same and you can still tell us the same story. Another example is if I'm telling the story of how I came to Christ, my testimony basically, which I'll put a link to in the description. I oftentimes leave out certain details or add in certain details depending on who I'm talking to try and get a certain point across, and that's basically what the Gospels are all about. Now, with that being said, if for whatever reason you want to hear an opinion other than mine, that's completely okay. You can Google it, you can search here on YouTube and find other people's voices on it. I'm obviously not the first person to throw my hat in the ring. I actually just read that from a source I found on Google. Alright, let's get to the next one. In Mark 10:19, they really want to go for Mark right now, Jesus said, "Thou knowest the commandments, do not commit adultery, do not kill, do not steal, do not bear false witness, defraud not, honor thy father and mother." Jesus needs to reread the 10 Commandments. There is no Old Testament commandment against defrauding. The only relevant statement about defrauding is in Leviticus 19:13, which says, "Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor." This is an Old Testament law, but is not listed with the 10 Commandments. Surely if Jesus was God incarnate, he would know the commandments. So, I think people place a little bit too much emphasis on the 10 Commandments sometimes. The 10 Commandments basically summarize the rest of the Old Testament. They are not a be-all or end-all to understanding the Old Testament, not just the stories, but understanding the laws, especially within the first 5 books of the Bible that God sets out for the Jewish people. Part of this may just be that we've had 2 really good films over the years about the Exodus story. We've had the 10 Commandments, obviously, and we've had Prince of Egypt, both of which are really good for different reasons. Well, one of them puts a lot of emphasis on the 10 Commandments. In reality, there's, I think, hundreds of commandments just in those last few books of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. So in most of Exodus, actually, you've got a lot of laws that God sets up for people, not just the 10 Commandments. And then you have Numbers and Deuteronomy, which set up a lot of other laws, too, in addition to all the other story stuff that's going on there. The point is, Jesus is not saying, "Thou knowest the 10 Commandments." He is saying, "Thou knowest the law. Thou knowest the commandments of the law of the Old Testament." So he can refer to the 10 Commandments, he can refer to any other part of the Pentateuch that talks about laws, and he's still talking about the same thing. So there's no contradiction. It's just an overemphasis that culturally we tend to have on the 10 Commandments being some sort of be-all, end-all, God's top 10 list, I've heard. That's not how it works. All parts of the Old Testament were just as relevant to the Jewish people at the time, and they're still relevant to us today for teaching according to Paul. He wrote that in his letter to the Romans. So basically, still a relevant commandment, just not part of the Old Testament, and doesn't have to be, so it still stands as a statement. Alright, let's move on. 2 more in this video. "And no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man which is in heaven." John 3:13. If Jesus is in heaven, how can he be down on earth speaking? Moreover, according to 2 Kings 2:11, "And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven," Jesus was not the only person to ascend into heaven, nor was he the first. Elijah preceded him, and apparently Enoch did also, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Genesis 5:24. So real quick, the part about Jesus saying he is in heaven, he's talking about heaven being his residency, his living place, his dwelling place, if you will. Just because he was on earth for a short period of time doesn't mean that when he says he's in heaven while he's in earth that it's a contradiction. It's just him talking about he lives in heaven while he happens to be residing temporarily down on earth. For the second part, it gets a little bit more interesting. So a website that I found that's actually really helpful is Stack Exchange, actually. So I'm going to just kind of summarize what I'm reading here. Basically, Jesus was the first person who was lifted up from the dead into heaven. Elijah and Enoch both entered into heaven while they were still alive. Jesus was dead and went up to heaven that way. Moreover, Jesus went from heaven, technically, down to earth, died on earth, went up to heaven, and then came back down for the resurrection. So what Jesus is saying is that he's the only person who came down from heaven to earth only to go back up again. So essentially, he's just saying something different than the way that it's being interpreted by the people at evilbible.com. And it's kind of an understandable misinterpretation, so I'm glad I was able to clear that up a little bit. Okay, last question. In Luke 23:43, Jesus said to the thief on the cross, "Today shalt thou be with me in paradise." This obviously has to be false, according to them, for Jesus was supposed to lay dead in the tomb for 3 days following his crucifixion. So the point of what Jesus is saying, because he died on the cross the same day as the thief, he was saying that they would both go up to heaven together. And Jesus' body did lie in the tomb for 3 days, but Jesus' spirit, who Jesus really was, because Jesus is not his body, I'm not my body, you're not yours. Jesus is saying that their spirits would be together in heaven on that day. Since they both died that day, they both were, and it's a true statement. And that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been able to answer some of these questions for you guys in a way that makes sense to you and helps really enhance your guys' faith. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to like, comment, share this video around. Hopefully someone from evilbible.com will respond to me and I might be able to get a one-on-one dialogue with them. All right, have a blessed day or a blessed night. I'll see you guys in the next video.